President, fellows, and guests. Although my title contrasts the mental and the material, as some of you may have guessed, my conclusion is that we can enrich our understanding of art history by thinking even of the mental as material, that is, in neural terms. Indeed, it is appropriate to advance this argument to an audience of scholars who share a passion for material antiquities. My dream would be that at the end of the lecture, you might all come to feel that the most valuable antiquity in your possession is your brain. Certainly, one of my main aims is to persuade you that we should take more seriously the material dimension of all human mental activity. To make clear what I mean, we can look again at Abbot Suger's commentary on the very first Gothic building, the Abbey of Saint-Denis. This commentary takes up a metaphor used by St. Paul in his letters to the Ephesians. The Abbey's columns, Suger writes, are spiritually edifying. Already, I quote, "Already you are built upon the foundations of the apostles and the prophets, with Jesus Christ as your crowning cornerstone, he who joins both walls and in whom the whole edifice, whether spiritual or material, grows to become a temple dedicated to the Lord." St. Paul's architectural metaphor applied to the church as an institution, but Suger for the first time applies it to a real building. People have always found the assimilation of the Christian community to a building an inspiring metaphor. Now the latest neuroscience shows why. One of neuroscience's most important findings is that when we imagine something, we use the same neural resources we would have used if we were experiencing it in reality. If we imagine a building, we use the same networks we would use if we were looking at one. And another finding of neuroscience is that when we look at anything, we are apt to empathize with its properties. When we look at or imagine a stone building, we feel its strength in us. So Suger was right to expect that the reader would empathize with the properties of all the elements in his metaphor: building, columns, walls, and lapis angularis, cornerstone or keystone. Now, why did Suger formulate such an elaborate invitation to his readers to relate the architectural imagery of Paul's letter to the Ephesians and the real architecture of his new building? The answer is almost certainly revealed by the emphasis, much greater than in the Pauline text, on the two walls of the church being united in Christ. We know from the contemporary commentary on the dedication rite, composed by one of Suger's principal advisors, Hugh of St. Victor, that the two walls of a church were then seen to represent the laity and clergy. And the relationship between laity and clergy was one on which Suger had concentrated. He was a close friend of Louis VII of France, and he spent his whole life in the service of both Louis and his father, Louis VI, exploring ways in which a unity of church and state could at last provide France with the strength and stability it needed. Suger saw both his new building and the commentary he wrote on it as directly contributing to this goal. Neuroscience thus suggests one of the hidden mental origins of Gothic, that is, the power of our unconscious response to architecture, and we can illuminate those origins further if we go back to ancient Rome and reinsert Paul's commentary into its historical setting, as we have reinserted Suger's. Paul's letter was not just a generally inspiring metaphor. It was conceived to deal with a problem that was omnipresent in early Christianity, but particularly urgent at Ephesus. At the site of one of the greatest temples of the ancient world, that city had a thriving community of ex-pagans alongside that of ex-Jews. It was more divided than most, and it was to resolve the tensions between them that Paul came up with the idea of exploiting the Old Testament's prefiguration of Christ as the headstone of the corner, a caput anguli, by making the stone able to bring together two walls, one made up of Jews and the other of Gentiles. Paul's church, like that of Suger, was not just a place where many individuals were united, but where two dangerously opposed communities could be integrated into one structure. It is an attractive conception, but it has an important limitation. Two walls meeting at an angle does not suggest a real church building. Paul's building is only metaphorical. Suger's was real, and as we shall see, it gave material expression to all of Paul's metaphors, and that is why it provided the template for a whole new style, the one we call Gothic. This talk is a study of the hidden mental processes that made possible that material fulfillment of Paul's vision. As will become clear, a recurrent theme is the way architecture often played a role in negotiating social and cultural divisions. An early example is the Temple of Concord at Rome. Erected in the late 2nd century and rebuilt under Tiberius. Originally intended to consolidate concord between the opposing political forces of the patricians and the plebs, it was not long like most temples, but exceptionally wide, and being, I hope you can see it up here, and being sited at one end of the forum, it effectively brought that space's two sides together. As a built structure, it achieved for Roman political life what Paul hoped his metaphorical structure would do for Ephesian religious life. Now, another more complex example is found within a decade of Paul's death, around 67 AD. At this stage, the whole Roman Empire was riven by a major cultural split, that between the Greek and Latin languages, with the first dominant in the east and the second in the west. It was emblematic that Nero, emperor at the time of Paul's martyrdom, was notoriously fond of things Greek, while Vespasian, who succeeded him, presented himself as being truly Italian and the guardian of Roman values. One of the ways in which Vespasian and his sons, Titus and Domitian, expressed the superiority of Roman culture over Greek was the introduction of a new capital, which they used prominently on the Colosseum, on the residence in the Palatine, and on the triumphal arch of Titus. It was its use in the latter which suggested to Alberti in the 15th century that it should be understood as a new Roman or Italian order. For him, the capital's combination of elements of the three canonical Greek orders, Doric, Ionic, and Corinthian, was a powerful expression of Rome's superiority over Greece, an interpretation suggested by its introduction on Titus's triumphal monument and confirmed by its use on all later triumphal arches until that of Constantine. Its form cleverly acknowledged Rome's debt to Greece while demonstrating her superiority. Even today, we can all understand the effectiveness of the combination. What we cannot share is its visceral, or rather neural, impact on viewers at the time. This is only revealed by the latest neuroscience. As brain scans show, the mere sight of physical pain apparently being inflicted on a friend activates the pain center in our own brain, the insula. This makes it likely that a Greek who observed the capitals that were separately emblematic of his cultural superiority being violently forced together on a Roman arch of conquest would have felt some sort of pain, almost as if the violence was applied to him. And there is support for the currency of such a response in the contemporary emergence of another phenomenon, so-called damnatio memoriae, that is, the destruction of images and the erasing of names of hated individuals. Rigorously applied to Sejanus, who was executed for his imperial ambitions in 31 AD, it was subsequently applied to Nero and many others. Neuroscience suggests that such damage might have caused the hated individual's supporters real pain. Now, this neural explanation for such manipulation can also be supported by what Pliny the Elder, in his great encyclopedia, The Natural History, written under Vespasian, says about the rise of magic in this time. A good example is what he says about knots. When Pliny tells us that putting one's arms around one's knees can prevent a nearby woman from giving birth, or that crossing and uncrossing one's legs can prevent people at a meeting from coming to an agreement, he is sharing a commonly held belief. He had no idea of its source. Neuroscience explains it. If we look frequently at any class of object, in this case a knot, our brain will acquire a set of networks in the temporal lobe which links to other areas where the properties associated with that object are remembered. Anyone exposed to knots would have experienced the way that they constrain and reduce movement in the thing to which the knot or binding is attached. In the brain of such a person, the area in the temporal lobe where the forms of knots and bindings are categorized would be neurally linked to other brain areas where all hopes and fears associated with the consequences of binding are experienced. Since someone putting their arms around their knees and removing them, or somewhere crossing and uncrossing their legs, could be seen by the brain as knot-like, they were liable to activate the same hopes and fears. This was why such actions could be exploited for magical purposes to either heighten or resolve anxieties. Similar neural processes underlie Pliny's recommendation in the same passage that the stable symmetrical entwinings of the reef knot, the so-called knot of Hercules, should be used both in the bandage of a wound and in a girdle worn every day. Such bindings, which evoke stability because the more you pull on them, the stronger they become, and which promote a sense of control because they are simple and are easily undone by the wearer, are experienced neurally as profoundly reassuring, which explains their prominence on the belts of the statues of emperors, as here of Nero, as well as in wedding jewellery. And we can understand a comparable device, the so-called dextrarum junctio, in the same way, which is why it could be used on this coin of Nerva, 96 to 98 AD, to express Concordia exercitum, concord of the armies. And the neural power of this emblem can be seen to be enhanced by neural mirroring, as we now know that looking at the hand of someone else can activate the nerves controlling our own, without causing it to move. This ensures that when we see such an emblem, we remember the reassurance we have gained when shaking hands ourselves. Pliny knew nothing of the neural basis of such magic, but by telling us that it is found in all times and places, he identifies it as a universal human trait, preparing the ground for J.G. Fraser, who in his Golden Brow, a study of human behavior worldwide, classified magic into universal types, such as sympathetic and contagious. Fraser doesn't talk of neuroscience, but by describing these examples as illustrations of what he called laws of thought, he allows for those laws to be biological, and you would have known that German neuroscientists had recently recognized that Einfühlung, empathy, had a neural basis. It is significant that all the examples of visual magic that we have considered can be seen as resolving anxieties by increasing certainty in an uncertain situation. And this helps to recognize another contemporary visual expression as working in the same way. We saw that under Vespasian, the composite, or Italian capital, was probably intended to strengthen Roman confidence after a period when things Greek had been in the ascendance under Nero. A later emperor, Hadrian, instead, negotiated the tension between the cultures by giving them equal status. He built libraries both at Rome and in Athens, giving equal treatment to the two languages, and embodied that equal treatment in his own dress, regularly alternating the wearing of the Greek pallium and the Roman toga, whose shape you see here. This allows us to see some of the most remarkable traits of his pantheon in terms of the same duality. Once we know that the Greek pallium was often characterized as rectangular and the Roman toga as round, we can recognize the pantheon's plan as a combination of a rectangular Greek and a round Roman building type. And it is a small step to understand the alternation of segmental and triangular pediments in the interior in the same light. A justification for doing so is provided by considering the theatre buildings. That was the context, as here at Taormina, or here at Sabratha, where an alternation of rounded and angular forms was most frequent, and also where Greek and Roman dramas, respectively characterized as palliata and togata, that's by actors wearing pallia or togata, alternated on the stage. The suggestion is also supported by the prominent use of an alternation of triangular and segmental pediments in two bilingual library buildings put up at the close of Hadrian's reign. At either end of the empire, the library in the Basilica of Plotina in Nîmes, which you see here, and that of Celsus in Ephesus. We might just say that such alternations are purely ornamental. I hope you can see at the top, there's a triangular pediment in the middle and two segmental pediments either side. But I would argue that we should go further, seeing them as magically resolving uncertainty by ensuring that people actually experience the balance in them in their own bodies. For this to happen, people didn't need to consciously know that one form was Greek and one was Roman. All that was necessary was for them to sense that angular forms were more Greek and round ones more Roman, which they might have done based on other differences besides that of costume, such as that between the two alphabets. Not only are many Greek letters angular and their Roman equivalents rounded, as you see here, but several Greek letters have the shape of triangular pediments. You may think that we are getting further and further from my theme tonight, but I would like to think that unconsciously we are now closer to understanding the mental origins of material Gothic than we were before the lecture. For a start, we now know that St. Paul and the early emperors shared anxieties about the relationships between two cultures, and that both he and they saw architecture as having a productive role in their resolution. The architecture may have been metaphorical in Paul's case and real in the emperor's, but the neural benefits to those exposed to them were similar. In the following centuries, anxieties about religion did not recede. Indeed, they constantly needed to be renegotiated, as with the victory of Christianity over the pagan religions in the 4th century. We can see this in the houses of worship of the new religion. Their builders might have endowed them with the regularity and unity that were the hallmarks of the perfect pagan temple. They might simply have transferred sections of complete colonnades from disused temples to the new churches, but they didn't. They wanted to benefit from the prestige of their rich forms, but they also needed to destroy the authority of the religion with which they were associated, as we see in San Lorenzo fuori le Mura at Rome, 579-90. The sections of entablature along the nave are magnificent, but they are completely jumbled. Precisely because formal perfection was the hallmark of a pagan temple, it had to be avoided. The resultant combination of elements taken from different buildings in many ways recalls the composite capital, and we are justified inferring that it would have had a similar impact on the neural resources of viewers. Anyone with a lingering affection for paganism would have felt wounded and weakened when viewing such an arrangement. The same problem surfaced when Islam replaced Christianity in the Eastern Mediterranean. Muslims wanted to benefit from the prestige of architectural forms associated with imperial authority and the Christian religion, but they needed to break their power. This is most evident in the first great building, the Dome of the Rock, erected in Jerusalem in 688-92 by the Umayyad Caliph Abd al-Malik. Its architecture was calculated from the beginning to emphasize both continuity and rupture. Its main purpose was to imitate and surpass the Anastasis, the new temple built over Christ's body a few hundred yards away, as the divinely approved successor to the Jewish temple. It's on the site of the Jewish temple it's constructed. And in its plan and formal vocabulary, it clearly recalled the model of the Anastasis Rotunda. In other ways, though, it was decisively differentiated, most strikingly in its geometrical properties. One difference was the 3-degree rotation out of perfect symmetry of the two squares underlying the dome's octagonal layout. I hope you can just make out that, although it is very geometrical and very regular, the central circle is 3 degrees, is rotated 3 degrees so that nothing lines up as it would do if the geometry was perfect. Given that such a scheme of interlocking squares had been essential to the perfection of the plans of so many Roman and early Christian octagonal structures, its rupture in the first Islamic successor is telling. Even more so is the decisive rupture with tradition in the building's interior elevation. There, the round arch form, used in all prestigious earlier structures, is still employed in the dome's outer arcade, but is replaced in the inner arcade by one that is pointed. That the change is significant is clear from the subsequent history of the pointed arch. Used again in the neighbouring Al-Aqsa Mosque, completed in 705, and in the Great Mosque of Damascus, 706-15, it was taken up in thousands more Islamic buildings over the following centuries. As Peter Draper has shown, it clearly came to be a symbol of Islam. Draper could not explain why. Today we can. if we use neuroscience to gain privileged access to the hidden neural networks of the mind. One way of describing the common element between the striking modification of the geometry of both plan and inner elevation is to say that they involve breaking with an existing practice by the twisting of a square in one case and the fracturing a round arch in the other. Now, twisting and breaking are both features of many rituals involving sympathetic magic, designed to disempower an individual or an institution, as when a doll representing an enemy is broken or has its head twisted off. And such sympathetic magic works because, as we noted earlier, once our brain associates an object with a particular individual or institution, whatever is done to it is experienced as being done to that individual or to that institution. We have seen such sympathetic magic being employed by Romans in the invention of the composite capital, and by Christians in the jumbling of classical forms. The latter magic enabled Christians to meet two needs, that is, to both exploit the beauty of authority of the pagan forms, at the same time to break their power. The needs of Muslims were similar. They wanted to get the benefits of associating themselves with the forms associated with both the dominant preceding political authority, the Byzantine Empire, and the preceding religion of the book, Christianity. However, they also needed their religion to be distanced from both those traditions. Breaking the geometries that were important shared attributes was one way to achieve that goal. Most visibly obvious was the rupture of the round arch form. This would not only have reassured Muslims, it would have dismayed the Christians, whose attribute it had been for so long, perhaps causing them to feel pain in their insulas. By giving the general forms of classical and Christian architecture By keeping the general forms of classical and Christian architecture, they benefited from their positive associations, but by destroying their geometry, they distanced themselves from those that were negative. By keeping the classical and Christian round arch in the outer colonnade and using their new pointed or broken form in the inner, they also made clear how Muslims had replaced Christians in God's affection, just as Christians had once replaced Jews. Now, someone who had a similar need to use architecture to comment on the relations between different religious traditions at exactly the same period was the Venerable Bede, 673 to 735. Living in Northumbria, he was anxious to bring a positive message to a community that had only recently been Christianized. This is most obvious in his commentary on Solomon's Temple, the De Templo. In it, he makes the surprising statement that the temple was superior to the tabernacle because it was built by non-Jewish Phoenicians. The news that God's first permanent home was built not by his people, the Jews, but by Gentile pagans, was certainly reassuring to people who had only, in England, who had only recently been pagans themselves. He also summed up his architectural commentary on his architectural commentary on religious history by telling how the two columns, Yachim and Boaz, representing the two communities of the Jews and the Gentiles, stood before the temple, which represented the Christian church. The use of a spatial relationship in architecture to communicate a chronological relationship between religions exactly parallels that we proposed for the Dome of the Rock, completed a few years earlier. Now, Bede's commentary on the verbal description of the temple is particularly important because it had a direct impact on built architecture through the influence of Bede's heir, Alcuin, at the Carolingian court, a century later. One of the most interesting and overlooked aspects of that influence was a remarkable engagement with paganism, which ended up having a substantial impact on the history of architecture. The decisive event was Charlemagne's destruction of the Irminsul on the Eresburg in 772. This Irminsul, or Irmin column, identifiable by its volute-like branches, which had its origin in tree worship, had a central role in the belief system of the Saxons, who saw the column as, it said at the time, supporting everything. Its destruction was a potent example of sympathetic magic and would have had a severe impact on people's nervous systems, what it would have done if someone had not had the idea of replacing the ermine column with something unknown before, a Christ column. The first of these is in the crypt of the chapel of St. Michael at Fulda, 820 to 822, where a single column, identified as Irminsul-like by its volutes, supports the vault. As the chronicler Candidus tells us, the whole building prefigures Christ and the church. That is a church built of living stones that is constructed of holy men, with the column in the crypt representing Christ, who is the foundation, a column remaining unshattered by virtue of his perpetual majesty, on whom the whole building grows into a temple sacred to the Lord. The description of the Christ column as unshattered is well calculated to bring out the logic behind Christ's superiority to the Irminsul, but it also reminds us that the whole conception of the building is the product of a fusion of pagan and Christian beliefs. The pagan Saxons' trust in the ability of the Irminsul column to support everything was deeply embedded in their neural systems. Its destruction left them with a void in their feelings about the world. It was a stroke of genius to present Christ as a superior replacement. His ability to support everything expressed by giving him the role of a column supporting a whole church. People who once neurally empathized with the Irminsul could now neurally empathize with the Christ column. At St. Michael's Fulda, the role of the Christ column is to satisfy an anxiety about support, but such was the fruitfulness of the contact between Christianity and Saxon paganism that soon Christ columns were also satisfying the anxieties about division which had troubled Christianity since Paul. A clear case is the crypt of St. Wigbert at Quedlinburg, not far from Fulda, built around 930. There the meaning of the Christ column, again identified as an Irminsul by its volutes, is expressed through both sighting and form. Situated in the centre of the apse, it represents the place where the chapel's two walls meet. As Paul envisaged in the letter to the Ephesians, while its square shape, contrasting with the four round columns representing the evangelists either side, makes visible the assimilation between Christ and the lapis angularis, or cornerstone of the Old Testament. Here at Quedlinburg, we don't know who the two walls that meet in Christ represent. They could be the Jews and the Gentiles, like the two columns in front of the temple in Bede's interpretation, but they could also be Christians and pagans. Whatever the case, the chapels at Fulda and Quedlinburg represent the first effective expression of St. Paul's metaphor in a real building, and only because Christ is assimilated to the pagan Irminsul. Now, what is important about both buildings is not just that they are the first structures which go far beyond St. Paul's vision in their metaphorical coherence. They owe that coherence not to reading about theological texts, but to the need to match the effectiveness of pagan experience and belief. It was because in that mental world, a column representing a tree so effectively reminded people of the benefits of such vertical supports that it inspired Christians to use architecture to similar effect. The expressive achievement this represented might have been lost if it hadn't been picked up by a monk from Fulda who advised on the construction of the chapel of St. Michael and who went on to become Archbishop of Mainz, Rabanus Maurus. Rabanus wrote a great encyclopedia, the De Universo, whose main theme was the mystic signification of things. His discussion of architecture in terms of mystic signification absorbed the lessons of Saxon paganism and so transmitted them to the Christian world, where they could infiltrate the world of Suger and Saint-Denis. This helped pagan thinking to become one of the hidden origins of the style we call Gothic. So, at last we can return to Saint-Denis. What was it about that structure that was so powerfully expressive that effectively started a new way of building? Now, since it was the combination of pointed arches and ribbed vaults that became the hallmark of the new style, it is their role at Saint-Denis that we have to understand first. We can begin with the pointed arch, which constitutes the most striking change from the round arches that had been universal in European architecture since the Romans. There were one or two examples of their use earlier, but in Saint-Denis they are omnipresent, both in the West End, 1135 to 40, and in the choir, 1140 to 44. In looking for an explanation, we cannot do better than follow Peter Draper in turning to Islam. As we argued earlier, using a pointed arch made it possible for Muslims to literally break the power of the imperial and Christian institutions with which the round arch was associated. And the same reasons would have made the pointed arch appealing to Suger. In the 12th century, religious buildings were getting larger and more magnificent, and in France were incorporating ever more features taken from pagan Roman monuments. But this wave of opulence provoked a tide of criticism, of which St. Bernard's are only the most famous. For Suger, who wanted to build an abbey that expressed the power and authority of the French monarchy, that was a real problem. The pointed arch was his solution. By breaking the arch, which was a symbol of Roman power, he distances himself from that tradition. And he may have got the idea directly from the Dome of the Rock, which would have made a big impression on Christians when they retook Jerusalem in 1099, just beforehand. Indeed, there is one feature of Suger's church which looks as if it was explicitly inspired by that structure. The apse was surrounded by 2 rows of columns, the inner ones, as he tells us in the De Administratione, representing the apostles, and the outer the prophets, making the building a commentary on religious history analogous to what we found in the Dome of the Rock. There, the 2 rock rings represented Islam's replacement of imperial Christianity. At Saint-Denis, they represented Christianity's replacement of Judaism. That is, apostles replacing prophets. Suger, of course, never went to Jerusalem, but many did, and anyone who had been sensitized to the use of architecture to express religious history in the way we noted earlier would have easily been alerted by the message on the Temple Mount. This would have been particularly likely for someone who knew the text of Hosea, where we are told that God, in his anger at the Hebrews, as if using sympathetic magic, said he would crush their bows, break their bows. Since the Latin word for bow, arcus, is also the word for arch, the Crusaders may well have felt that by breaking arches, they should show God that they had got his message. Nor was this an isolated example of taking a practice over from the Muslims. When the Christians were ejected from the Holy Land in the 7th century, they felt it was a sign of God's displeasure and sought to learn from those who had replaced them in his favour. The clearest example of this is the return to Moses' prohibition of imagery, which gave birth to iconoclasm. The pointed arch is another. The breaking of arches echoes the breaking of images. But what about rib vaults, such as this in the narthex of Saint-Denis? They had only been used very occasionally earlier. What made Suger adopt them with such enthusiasm? The answer is almost certainly their capacity to elicit another neurally driven unconscious response. The diagonal lines, which are its principal features, had an important role in the ritual of church dedication at the period. The ritual involved the priest making 2 lines on the floor of the church, one from the left-hand side at the east end to the right-hand side at the west, and the other from the right-hand side at the east to the left-hand side at the west, so creating a diagonal cross. This sounds like magic, and even more like magic is the fact that the lines should be made in ashes, in which, according to the Roman pontificals of the period, letters of the alphabet should be inscribed, Greek on one line and Latin on the other, effectively giving them the property of a magic spell. What this magic was intended to achieve was much discussed in the early 12th century and is illuminated by commentaries on the right by 2 of the most influential theologians. One was Hugh of St. Victor, one of Suger's advisors, who wrote that the 2 walls of the church represent the 2 double pairings of Jews and Gentiles and laity and clergy. As he says, the diagonal cross marked on the floor of the church during the dedication rite shows how faith, I quote, faith began with the Jews and later went over to the Gentiles. Honorius of Autun, his contemporary, went further, saying that the 2 lines actually represent the Jews and the Gentiles, who, had they kept going straight, would have persisted in error, but who had in fact come together in Christ. That is where the lines cross. Who is the cornerstone or keystone. Now, this last point is crucial because the reference to a keystone implicitly transfers what is said about the lines on the ground to vaults above, creating a superior expression of Paul's metaphor in the letter to the Ephesians. Once Christ is seen not as a cornerstone, but as a keystone of a vault, it is much easier to see how the church grows together in him. And once the diagonal lines of the dedication ritual are thought of as representing two communities meeting in Christ, it is easier to see how Paul's vision of a reconciliation between Jews and Gentiles can come about. These two communities, though, were not the ones that people worried about in the early 12th century. One pair was that people worried about was that of the Eastern Greek and Western Latin churches, whose schism began in 1054. And there can be no doubt that it was that schism that the writing of two alphabets on the lines was intended to resolve. The resonance with Hadrian's use of alternating pediments in the Pantheon, also to reconcile Greek and Latin-speaking communities, is striking. In Suger's France, by contrast, it was rather the tension between clergy and laity, referred to by Hugh of St. Victor, that most divided the church. The relationship between these two bodies, which had been vexed for some time, came to a head in the investiture controversy, a dispute about whether the right to appoint bishops belonged to church or state. Most dangerous had been the violent confrontation between the Pope Paschal II and the Emperor Henry IV around 1100. As Hugh of St. Victor had said, the dedication ritual, with its cross of diagonal lines on the floor, was a perfect way to suggest a reconciliation between the two forces. In San Miniato, Florence, which is the building that I showed you before, which was a focus of tension between Pope and Emperor at this time, the diagonal cross left a permanent trace in the chiastic arrangement of Corinthian and composite capitals around the main altar. I don't want to, but this capital, these are composite capitals here and here, these capitals here are Corinthian, so that the asymmetrical pairing of these columns, capitals, indicates that the builder is taking up the idea that was in the diagonal lines made on the floor and expressing it in the building. So that this happens around the main altar where the lines meet in Christ. The vault made such a trace both permanent and highly visible. When the diagonal lines met in a keystone, the reconciliation was even more palpable. For congregations disturbed by the dispute between clergy and laity, the permanent new vault form was a more effective form of magic than the cross temporarily marked on the church floor at the moment of dedication. Only through diagonal ribs meeting in an aerial keystone, a lapis angularis, a caput anguli, could the reconciliation promised by the temporary cross of ashes on the floor be seen to acquire durability. Repeated in each bay of a church, this symmetrical binding of the two walls again and again provided the same reassurance, sharing aspects of both form and function with the knot of Hercules and the Dextrarum Junctio. At Saint-Denis, this could not be fully achieved because Suger was only able to rebuild the west and east ends of the church. These parts do, however, have features. Sorry, I should say this is Saint-Denis as built later on in the 13th century, and you can see that it's got literally tens of vaulted bays in which this X pattern is repeated. I would argue everywhere with the same associations, unconscious or conscious. These parts, that's the east and the west ends of Suger's buildings, do, however, have features which confirm that Suger's overall conception was of a building whose two walls were united by Christ. For example, the first time in medieval art that Christ is shown in the keystone of an arch is at the summit of the main portal of Saint-Denis, where he appears as an element in the Trinity. I hope you can see at the top of that slide. That this image at the centre of the abbey's facade was seen as indicating how the two walls of the church meeting Christ is supported by the unique architecture of the opposite end of the building, the central chapel of the apse. In every other contemporary or earlier church, the central feature was a window set in a curved wall, as you see here at Saint-Cernin in Toulouse at the bottom. But at Saint-Denis, the central feature is a pier flanked by two windows either side of that pier. Representing the notion that this unusual configuration was designed to express the meeting of two walls representing two traditions is supported by the subjects of the two windows either side of that pier, the tree of Jesse and the life of the Virgin. These were appropriate representations of the dualism of Old and New Testaments, Jews and Gentiles, appropriately joined by a lapis angularis between them, representing Christ. At Saint-Denis, Suger and the Masons constructed a building whose architecture would have powerfully affected the neural equipment of those who saw it, especially those who were troubled by uncertainties, in a way that no previous structure could have. To his contemporaries, the neurally embedded anxieties that it would have helped to relieve were, besides the ever-present uncertainties about entry into paradise, those about the morality of large and expensive buildings, about the danger of using Roman forms, and about the relation between the cleric, such as Suger, and laymen such as the king, whose chancellor he was. To the extent that later generations shared those anxieties, they would have shared that relief. To any believer, the combination of supporting columns, pointed arches, opposed walls meeting, both at the top of the building in keystones, at the centre of cross vaults, and at its end in an angular division between two windows, would always have offered unconscious reassurance of the stability of a church that, in spite of its divisions, could be experienced as united in Christ. That was the magic of the building, its combination of forms. That others felt this magic is confirmed by the first English building to employ the pointed arches and ribs developed at Saint-Denis, the choir of Canterbury Cathedral, complete with a shrine to the murdered St. Thomas à Becket, begun in 1174. The four piers of the Eastern Crossing were described by the contemporary chronicler Gervase as meeting in a keystone, and the fact that that keystone carries a sculpture of Christ, the Lamb, suggests that the building directly takes up Suger's notion of a living church growing together in Christ. Given the tensions between church and state, there could not have been a better spot to reaffirm the unity of the church than the place where an archbishop had been murdered at the behest of a king. Now, throughout this paper, I've argued that the reason why the mental origins of Gothic are hidden is because they are not rational, that is, founded either in theological argument or engineering logic, but neural and magical. Now, the clearest evidence of this is the way the round arch was abandoned in favour of the pointage. That this has nothing to do with its assumed structural advantages in high buildings is clear. Not only were the Muslims who first adopted the form completely uninterested in interior height, but the patrons who were foremost in disseminating the pointed arch outside France and the great cathedrals were precisely the leaders of those ecclesiastical orders who expressly shunned height on moral grounds. The reason why first the Cistercians, already in the 12th century, and then the Franciscans and Dominicans in the 13th, repeatedly rejected the round arch in favour of the pointed, so spreading it throughout Europe, can have nothing to do with its structural advantages. It makes much more sense to relate their use of the pointed arch to their agenda, the agenda they all shared, the desire to shun worldliness. For such institutions, faced with the need to build large new buildings while avoiding any charge of magnificence, the pointed arch was a talisman of probity, breaking the power of the rounded arch, which carried worldly associations that went back to ancient Rome. The hidden mental activity that led to the rise of Gothic had more in common with God when he broke the bows of the Hebrews than those of a modern structural engineer. Thank you.